Today at the National Press Club, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson and Deputy Pam Melroy. With plans to land the first woman and first person of colour on the moon, they'll outline their vision for the space partnership with Australia. Bill Nelson and Pam Melroy with today's Press Club address.
Hello. Oh, sorry. Bad timing. No lift off there. Hello and welcome to the National Press Club here in Canberra for today's Westpac address. My name is Julie Hare. I'm the Education Editor at the Australian Financial Review and a Board Director here at the club. Our guests today are NASA Administrator Senator Bill Nelson and Deputy Administrator Pam Melroy with their address titled The Artemis Generation, the Future of US-Australian Space Collaboration. Bill was appointed head of NASA by his old friend Joe Biden in 2021. Before that, he was a long-term Democrat senator for the state of Florida between 2001 and 18, and the last Democrat senator for that state to date. He also had the good fortune of being written into history by travelling to space on Space Shuttle Columbia's STC-61C, as the second only sitting congressional member to go into space. The mission on which he flew was as a payload specialist. I'm not sure what that is, perhaps he can explain. And landed just 10 days before the shocking Challenger malfunction resulted in the deaths of 7 astronauts just 73 seconds after liftoff. Unsurprisingly, he wrote a book about the experience. During his time as Senator, Senator Nelson was also involved in a host of committees in and around the space sector, so much so he was known as the Space Guy. Or maybe I'm making that up. Pam Melroy is NASA's 2IC. She's a former astronaut who has flown in 3 missions, including as pilot on 2 and head of command on the 3rd. She left NASA in 2009 and has held a few roles, including Deputy Director of the Tactical Technology Office in DARPA, the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency. In 2021, she was inducted into the US Astronauts Hall of Fame, which must be one of the smallest and most elite clubs in town. You can follow the conversation on Twitter at PressClubAust or hashtag NPC. Please welcome Senator Bill Nelson, followed by Pam Melroy. Thank you.
I have been so impressed in recognizing as a politician that the first thing that is appropriate to say is to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, and to pay my respect to elders past and present. And I'd also like to recognize all First Nations people here with us today. And I say that with the greatest respect coming from the United States, that would be a nice thing for us to do in the US. Indeed, it's a topic that is timely for me to make an observation, because I understand the Prime Minister has just had a press conference about what we call amending the Constitution to provide for the recognition of the First Nations people. You may be interested to know that one of the last crews to return from the International Space Station was commanded by a Native American woman commander, Nicole Mann, a test pilot, a jet pilot, and finally getting the recognition that we in America need to give. And so I really commend you very much for the way that you are respectful and deferential. Now let's talk about space. So this morning I was very honored to be with our ambassador, the daughter of a fellow that used to inspire me as a kid in school, because he dared to say and do things that were great. And he said, we're going to the moon within this decade, and that was only 8 or 9 years left. And he said, we're going all the way to the moon, and we're going to return safely in this decade. And then a year later, he went to a big football stadium in Texas. And President Kennedy said, we go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And space is hard. We are going back to the moon after a half century. But this time, we're going to a different moon. We're not going to the equator, where it's constant light, and where we had scouts on Apollo 8 and Apollo 10 that went down to within 10 miles of the surface to scout the Sea of Tranquility, the landing place. This time, we're going to a very forbidding place on the moon, the South Pole. If this is the moon, and this is the South Pole, the light from the sun comes in at an angle. And as a result, there are lots of deep shadows, and particularly since the bottom of the moon, the South Pole, is pockmarked with huge craters that are in constant darkness, you've got to be very precise in your landing. But we're going to the South Pole because we know there's ice there. We wonder if there is water in abundance. As a matter of fact, later this year, a lander will land with a NASA instrument that will drill to see if there's water under the surface. And if there's water, then there's rocket fuel. And we could have a gas station on the moon. But there's a lot of excitement about that. There's a lot of excitement among our competitors that want to go there, and they want to get there before we do. Within a week, we are going to announce the first crew to go to the moon. And it's instructive who this crew will be that Pam, our deputy administrator, an astronaut commander, as she has been already introduced to you, but by the way, only the second woman as an astronaut commander. A U.S. Air Force test pilot, only the third woman test pilot in the Air Force. Pam and I are going to make the announcement down in Houston of the crew, and it will have 3 Americans and 1 Canadian. And that's significant because we go to the moon this time as an international mission. Half a century ago, we went as the U.S. government. And each of our missions, as is the case with our missions that go to the International Space Station, a partnership of 15 nations in low Earth orbit. Each of our missions as we venture out into the cosmos will be international. They will also be public-private partnerships. We will go with commercial companies as our partners. So on the third mission to the moon, when we go into lunar orbit, in a polar orbit that will land on the South Pole, our astronauts will climb into a SpaceX lander, which is the winner of the first competition. We have a second competition that will be going on for a second lander. And that public-private partnership tells you about the new kind of space venturing forth that we are doing. But why go back to the moon? We were there over 50 years ago. This time we go to live, to learn, to invent, to create, to learn how to exist in a very hostile environment, an environment that has no atmosphere. When we get to Mars, we'll have a 1% atmosphere, in order to learn how to go out into the cosmos. As was said so eloquently by President Kennedy at Rice University Stadium, we set about on a cosmic sea, exploring new worlds, venturing forth on to new cosmic shores. Why? Because it's in our DNA. It's part of us, of who we are as adventurers, as explorers, as frontiers people. It's part of us also as we create and invent, as earthlings, new technologies to be able to venture forth. So the moon's only 3 or 4 days away. When we go to Mars, it's months and months, and that's why we've got to develop new technologies, new propulsion to get us faster to Mars, and then out beyond. And how big is the beyond? You're getting a glimpse of it now from the James Webb Space Telescope. The first pictures that came back, light having traveled at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second for 13.5 billion years. Only about 300 million years after the very beginning. That is the cosmic sea upon which we venture forth. It's important to us as we venture forth that we do so as earthlings in an international venture. And so that's really why Pam and I are here. Australia has been a crucial partner to the U.S. space program for more than 6 decades. Together, we became early signatories of the Artemis Accords, which are a common sense group of principles about how we will explore outer space in peace, helping others, commonality of instruments in order for emergencies that we could respond. That's the Artemis Accords. And Australia has invested additional resources in support of future NASA commercial lunar operations called CLIPS. There's going to be an autonomous Australian lunar rover currently slated for a 2026 launch. It's called the Trailblazer program, and it is going to dig around and gather up lunar dust or regolith and extract oxygen, even though the moon has no atmosphere. And last year, NASA made the decision to locate one of the 3 planned lunar exploration ground sites antennas in Australia in support of Artemis communications. Yesterday, we went out to what I so remember, Canberra. That was a familiar term to me as we orbited the Earth 98 times, way back, a long time ago in the early part of the Space Shuttle program. Because back then, we didn't have constant communication around the Earth. We didn't have the satellites that give us the instant communication. There were points on the Earth that there were the ground antennas that we could talk back home. Canberra was one of them. And so as we examined these huge dishes and we heard the story that this was the dish that received the words from Neil Armstrong when he stepped on the moon. It's history in front of us, and it was part of us in our missions. And so we're going to locate another for much more communication as we venture out. As a matter of fact, often in our deep space communications, we get a traffic jam. We need that concentration of communication to our human missions to the moon. Well, we also need it for the deep space contribution to the James Webb Space Telescope that's 1 million miles from Earth, looking out and receiving all of that infrared light. There's another commonality between Australia and the US because NASA is not only a space agency, and it's not only an aeronautical research agency. NASA is a climate agency. All those instruments up there, we designed them, we built them, we launched them, and many of them we operate. We're putting up 5 new great observatories over the next decade that will give us a 3D composite understanding of what is happening to the Earth in real time. And we at NASA are going to create the Earth Information Center, which will not only be a physical location, but a virtual one so that this information, real time, is available to everyone, including our international partners, including school children, to understand what is happening to our Earth. That is important to Pam and to me, because when you fly into space, there's a whole new perspective that you get. Paul Scully Power has that too. And that is, it's actually got a term. It's called the overview effect. You are seeing home from a different perspective. And there it is. It is so beautiful, and yet it looks so fragile. You look at the rim of the Earth and you'll see a thin film, and that's the atmosphere that sustains all of our life. You look further with the naked eye from that altitude, you can still see how we're messing it up. And I could give you example after example. And so we're a climate agency. And fortunately, with our friends in Australia, we both take this very, very seriously. But there's another reason that I'm glad that we're here. Because as a kid growing up and then as a lieutenant in the military, and later on participating in the space program, having the benefit of 42 years of elected public service, I have always had a special place in my heart for Australia. I've been here once before because I appreciate how Australia has, with the US, been a partner over so many threats, so many other challenges, including the challenges that we see today by others who are competitors in the Indo-Pacific region. And thus, all the more reason that I would like to see an Australian train and fly with us. It's all the more important. So, now I want to tell you and introduce you to the real deal. I've already told test pilot, astronaut commander, I address her as yes, ma'am. And indeed, our partner at NASA, Colonel Pam Melroy.
Thank you, sir. It is such a privilege to serve as Senator Nelson's deputy. It's really amazing. I should just make a comment that I think because both of us have flown in space, we have a perspective about teamwork that is a little bit different than most. When we talk about a crew, we have each other's backs, and our lives depend on each other. Hopefully not today. So, but greetings. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. The Ngunnawal and Ngambri people honor their elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize all First Nations peoples here today with us. I am so thrilled to be back in Australia after 3 years. My husband and I lived here for a year in 2018, made many friends, and of course, I'd been many times before that, and it's just really fantastic as we emerge into a post-COVID world to return and see all my friends. I'd like to unpack just for a moment one of the questions that we get asked all the time. How does space benefit people? Well, it is the role of the government to benefit our citizens. That is our job, and we're laser focused on that. We typically put things into 3 categories that really highlight the benefit of going to space. The first one is science. So the administrator mentioned the James Webb Space Telescope that is teaching us about the formation of the universe, the fundamental physics of time and space that we are learning. But you can bring it a lot closer to home, the work that we do in the solar system to understand the formation of the Earth, to understand why Mars used to have an atmosphere and flowing water and possibly life, and is now cold and barren. What can we learn from that? We also study foundational biological and physical sciences in microgravity. The only way to take out the force of gravity flying around the Earth on the International Space Station, we begin to see second-order effects and understand how to have more efficient fluid dynamics, more efficient combustion, and the development of pharmaceuticals that can actually help us here on Earth. And of course, let's bring it back to Earth. Bill mentioned the climate change and an existential threat to the whole world. We really can only understand the Earth as a system from space. It is impossible to get the data that we need without looking from space. So that scientific investment is actually the seed corn of technical and scientific capabilities of the future. The second bucket that we talk about is national capabilities and national posture. So what we have found through many years of doing things because they are hard, as President Kennedy said, is that we have capabilities that actually elevate all of the national technical and scientific capabilities of a country. And it can be everything from the development of the entire discipline of software engineering, which we did during Apollo, to developing a tiny camera that could fly on a chip to observe the Earth and other planets from space that is now the basis for the camera in your cell phone. So tremendous capabilities that lift across multiple areas, and increasingly economic benefit. We are very proud of the investments that we made at NASA more than a decade ago in our commercial space industry to support us. In the past, space has been the realm of governments. NASA would essentially design a capability and then turn it over to industry as our partner to build it. Well, the maturity of our industry was such that the intuition was maybe we didn't need to do all the design work. We certainly provided advice and safety oversight, but we turned it over to our industry to develop the capability to carry cargo at low cost to our International Space Station. And it unleashed something that we never expected: low-cost access to space. Before that, we were in a death spiral. The cost of access to space was so incredibly high that we couldn't launch or innovate very much in space because you just didn't have the money to invest in new capabilities from space. And so we were completely offshored the commercial launch industry in the United States. It was gone. The investment that we made in commercial cargo resulted in 3 companies developing low-cost access to space that also spurred the innovation. We enabled industry to also get their start on the International Space Station, whether it was through research or launching small sats from the space station. That death spiral has completely reversed. We've gone in the other direction, and our commercial space industry has unleashed so much innovation that we're just barely beginning to scratch the surface. So that has enormous economic benefit to our country, and it will for Australia also. And finally, as Bill mentioned, inspiration. So inspiration, the way we feel when we see the picture going back in time, 13.5 billion years towards the beginning of the universe, those pictures we see from James Webb Space Telescope. But more importantly, the other seed corn, STEM, the STEM generation. In both Australia and the United States, we have a critical gap and a critical need. And space has a very unique capability to inspire children to want to study STEM. I myself was completely inspired by Apollo to want to become a pilot, an engineer, a scientist, and an astronaut. And we believe that the Artemis generation will unleash that same tidal wave for us and for our partners to inspire a whole new generation. We're truly in the golden age of space. When we look back at Apollo, how amazing a feat it was to go with the limited technology that we had. In the 50 years since, we have developed the capability to understand how to repeatably and safely go to space, and through the International Space Station, how to keep people alive for long periods of time, and how to maximize the use of people for scientific purposes and exploration, because really humans are the ones who are most effective at doing science. So we are ready to return to the moon. The moon is different, and we are different. And so we're very focused in our Moon to Mars program, how we can prepare ourselves not just to go to the moon, not just to go to Mars, but actually create a blueprint for how humans will explore and sustain themselves throughout the solar system. This is an awesome responsibility. Bill mentioned the Artemis Accords, and it's why going as international partners is so critical to us. It's absolutely essential that we bring all the voices of Earth with us. We need to have a transparent framework. We need to be working together on interoperability, safety, but also the aspects of bringing the best of humanity into space for peaceful purposes, for scientific purposes, and for the gaining of knowledge and the benefit of everybody on Earth. So this is truly a golden age for us. Now that if you look back at aviation, the golden age of aviation is very different, in the 40s and the 50s. Government investments in going higher, further, faster for national capabilities spun very rapidly off into a commercial industry. And now we have the commercial aviation industry as we know it today that impacts every industry and enables all kinds of new business models and partnerships. And we believe space is on that same cusp. We're already seeing it in the United States. And Australia is well poised. I was so delighted at the formation of the Australian Space Agency for many reasons, both to see Australians tap into that global market and that global capability, but perhaps a little selfishly, because for NASA, our partners are space agencies. Prior to that, Australia had no front door for us. There was no one for us to go to partner with, and to engage with. We had a great relationship with CSIRO around the Deep Space Tracking Station, but really what we do is engage with space agencies across a full range, whether it's space, climate, aeronautics, and exploration. And so the formation of the space agency was critical for us. Very interestingly, the space agency also was focused on looking at that economic benefit. And I was astounded and delighted to hear that one of the goals, to develop 20,000 jobs by 2030, well, the number's already at 17,000. So good on you, Enrico. You're doing a good job. Australia has been a great partner in the past, but I think in the last 5 years, we've seen extraordinary strides. We were very excited to have the opportunity to take advantage of the unique geographical location in the southern hemisphere to launch sounding rockets with scientific experiments on it out of the Northern Territory last year. It was the first time the United States, NASA, had launched a commercial rocket outside our own country. So that is just the geographical benefits enable all kinds of interesting partnerships, as they already do with the tracking stations. In addition to that, we clearly have seen the extraordinary university system that Australia offers, and that's really important to us. The research that we do is the foundation of the future. So the technical activities, such as we saw plants in space at the University of Adelaide, those are the foundational investments that will support us on Moon to Mars and Artemis and going out into the solar system. In addition to that, the rover, very important capability to dig up regolith, but I'd like to also point out that that oxygen not only supports humans, but also is a part of creating rocket fuel for the future. So this is a first opportunity for Australia to leverage its very strong robotics capability, but also importantly, its skills in remote asset management. So if you can run a facility from 3,000 kilometers away in Perth, somewhere in the Pilbara, I think it's going to be a piece of cake to do it on the moon. That looks pretty hard to me, and I've seen some extraordinary capabilities. So bringing all those to bear, this Trailblazer program is an investment in the future. And I believe that Australia will be known for that capability in the future. I'd really like to also emphasize the point about partnerships. So it's critically important as we go out into the solar system that not only do we engage with our long-standing, close, deep partners such as Australia, but that together with Australia, we can actually reach all our partners around the world. We can reach the Asia-Pacific region, where you're so influential, to help bring the capacity that space brings and share the wealth. And I think that's an extremely important part that Australia can play too. Very influential in the region, and that makes them a wonderful partner for us. I would also like to say that I really think it's critically important to understand the value of what we do economically. We hold economic impact analysis. Our second one came out based on data from 2020. And what it showed was, because of course all the money that we spend at NASA is spent right here on Earth, there is no other place to spend it yet, but not even counting the technological capabilities that come from our spin-offs, just the economic activity that comes from our investments, it's 3 for 1. For every dollar that is spent at NASA, 3 times the number of economic impact in the United States. So we think this is a very, very important thing to understand for the future. And we think that the work that we are doing has scientific and also inspirational benefit, not just to each of our individual countries, but actually for the whole world. The first person to walk on Mars is in a classroom right now. It would be very exciting to see Australia continue to partner with the U.S. long term. We do hope that when we are ready to go to Mars, we will go as international representatives of Earth. That is the future. We will be shaping the future of humanity as we explore in the solar system, and we want to do it together. So it's been a delight to see Australia's progress in the last 5 years alone, building on many decades of cooperation, and we can't wait to see what will happen next. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Just before we head to questions from journalists, we're going to play a brief video from NASA. So I don't know what to expect, but I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
50 years after we last left footprints on the moon, NASA's Artemis 1 is our first bold step towards getting us back there and pushing us farther than we've ever been before. You are looking at the world's most powerful rocket and Orion spacecraft live on Launch Pad 39B. The energy here is palpable as we attempt to make history today.
We're going to learn so much about the solar system from the moon and even about the Earth.
Range weather. Weather is go for launch.
The mission management team has been pulled. You have a go to proceed with terminal count.
On behalf of all the men and women across our great nation who have worked to bring this hardware together to make this day possible, at this time I give you a go to resume count and launch Artemis 1.
4-stage engine start. 3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
SLS now traveling 607 miles per hour.
The harder the climb, the better the view. We showed the Space Coast tonight. What a beautiful view it is. The first step in returning our country to the moon and on to Mars.
We are understanding now from the James Webb Space Telescope just how big and vast this universe is. There's a lot out there to explore. And this is the next beginning.
Orion is now flying free, attached to the European Service Module and on its journey to the moon.
Thank you very much. Now, I get the first question. So, you mentioned that next week you're going to announce the first team of astronauts that will go to the moon since over, for several decades. That includes a Canadian. You also mentioned that you're hoping that an Australian might be part of one of the future teams. You also mentioned that Mars, someone who's going to step on Mars, is in a classroom now. Could you please both tell me, for all those kids out there in classrooms around Australia, what sort of skills and abilities and knowledge that they would need to be considered to be that Australian astronaut to set foot on Mars?
Study. Work on your character. Be kind to others. Remember, Pam mentioned what a crew does. A crew looks out for each other. And get ready, because it's coming.
Pam, do you have anything to add to that?
I will just add that it's really important to believe in yourself. When I was a little girl, and I wanted to be an astronaut. None of the astronauts looked like me,
Yeah.
but my parents told me that I could do anything that I wanted. And parents, it is true, your kids are listening. They really are. And so from my perspective, I was persistent and just kept working at it and kept studying and kept trying. And I think that's the most important thing of all.
Do you need to be good at maths and science?
You need to work at it.
Thank you. Our first question comes from Brendan Howe.
Thanks very much for your address today. Brandon Howe from innovationoz.com. First, I've got a question for Senator Nelson and then also for Colonel Melroy. First of all, Senator Nelson, you're calling for an Australian astronaut to be on board some of the NASA-led missions. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on perhaps seeing Australian rockets be used on NASA missions. Some Australian companies are looking within the next decade that could be feasible. Do you have any thoughts on whether this would be a point of economic competition or whether or not the Australian industry would be mature enough within the next decade? And sorry, just for Colonel Melroy, and sort of a follow-up, I suppose, you mentioned in the speech we need to be enhancing interoperability between international partners. The US-Australia Technology Safeguards Agreement's been worked on for the last year and a half. Just how important is this agreement in that spirit of international cooperation, and how does it fit in the context of growing strategic competition?
Your question, in essence, for me, is there room enough for Australian rockets and an Australian space contribution? And indeed, the answer is yes. We've seen, for example, a NASA instrument that is now in this unusual lunar orbit that the astronauts will orbit in, to characterize that orbit, and it was launched from New Zealand. There is such a vast opportunity, economic opportunity for businesses in a space-based economy as we improve our technologies, that there's going to be room for many, many. So the answer is yes.
I'll also add to that having partners who have launch capability, we've found enhances our resilience. We have all kinds of shared agreements, for example, with the European Space Agency, which has a launch capability. Sometimes they build a satellite and we put an instrument on it and they launch it. Sometimes we build a satellite and they put an instrument on it and we launch it. And even the James Webb Space Telescope was too large to fit on any of the rockets that were available at the time. So we worked out a partnership with ESA and they nailed it. They put it into space just where it needed to be. So there's a strong aspect of resilience as well for both countries. The technology safeguarding agreement is very important. The ambassador has assured us that she is keeping a close eye on that. It's absolutely essential for our industries to work together. And that's one tremendously important aspect of this growing space economy. We trade in so many ways. We must be partnered and do trade in the area of space too. Space is impacting every single industry: agriculture, oil and gas and mining, maritime. There's never been a demand for less bandwidth and less information, and space is the best place to get it. So having those partnerships, I think, will allow us to lift both industries.
And what better time than to do it right now as all of this is happening, but especially for Australia, in the aftermath of the AUKUS agreement, where you're going to have additional new technologies and a new highly educated and technological workforce that is as a result of that agreement. Why not have the parallel development of a space economy?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Nick Stewart.
G'day, Nick Stewart, Canberra Times. So, Senator Bill, I was so fascinated by your discussion of the dark side of the moon, where we've never been, that I was going to ask a question about whether or not that gas tank might be being operated by a moon person, but Ella told me I shouldn't ask that question because it was inappropriate. So, can I instead ask a far more serious question? Colonel Pam, you've been here in Adelaide before. You actually know Australia. You know the way we work. You also know that things only happen when government gets behind it in a really big way. Is there, you've had changes in the US over the last couple of weeks that have instituted a reformed agenda for space for the US. Do we actually need, you've been here working on the Australian space ideas. Do we actually need government to get behind space in a really significant way so that actually changing our bureaucratic architecture so that it does so? And finally, if I can throw a controversial one in, we have the billionaires travelling and getting a great view of the atmosphere of the Earth. Shouldn't they be paying someone for that? Shouldn't we actually be charging them an environmental fee to go up there and have a look at us?
I'll start with the first question, which was about the government getting behind space. And I have to say the signal of formation of the space agency was tremendous. I just can't emphasize that enough. And so I do think that the support of the government is behind the space economy and the space sector. It is very important. This is one of those things, it's a long program. This is about developing capabilities that are hard, but that lift all of your national capabilities. And so it has to be something that the government is willing to be consistent on, the same way they are on foreign policy and defense. And we're very, very blessed in the United States that we actually have very nonpartisan support, very bipartisan support for NASA. So I think that this is, it is critical that the government keep that steady cadence and tempo as they have been doing for 5 years.
The billionaires actually have contributed mightily to bringing down the cost of going into space. Very good example, the SpaceX rocket, the Falcon 9. I once asked our vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs a couple of years ago about just the cost of access to space for defense and intelligence payloads. He said in just a matter of a few years, the cost, because there was competition, had come down $40 billion at that point to the Department of Defense. So what you see is not only to NASA, but to any other government agency, scientific agency, whoever has a reason to have access to space, the economies that have been become affordable to go to space. Now, what you're referring to in a oblique manner is the billionaires going into space. So, why? Because we are encouraging them to create a commercial industry in space. Good example, we have the space station built in the mid to late 90s. It's getting pretty old. We're going to keep it going until 2030, and then we're going to deorbit. But we, the government, would still like to have access to space, but we don't want to spend our money there on a space station that is big as a football stadium, which it is. We want to be able to rent space on commercial space stations, and thus the beginning of commercial activity and space stations to get them to take over the activities in low Earth orbit so that we can spend our resources and energy looking out and exploring outward.
Would you like to see them paying an environmental levy to do that?
At this point, no, in its incipience. However, down the road, as part of our environmental sensitivities, and by the way, as I said, you can't go into space and not be environmentally sensitive. I became more of an environmentalist having gone into space, and that has informed all the decades of my public service.
Simon Gross.
Thanks for your talks. Simon Gross, Canberra IQ. It seems it's cool to ask two questions, so I'm going to follow up that trend. Firstly, you talked about the importance of engagement with other national space agencies. I wonder if you could characterise your engagement with your Chinese counterpart and the commercialisation of space. I think Elon Musk's Starlink is thinking about 30,000 satellites. Amazon's doing something similar. OneWeb, the places, there's going to be space congestion. So Nick talked about cost, or like a levy. There's no real regulation going on. How do you foresee in 10 years' time how you're going to manage congestion in the low Earth orbit sector?
I'll take the second question first. Around the world, space agencies differ. NASA is actually not the regulator of commercial space.
Yeah.
But we are the scientific and technical basis. For example, out of our work on orbital debris standard mitigation practices that were developed by our technical teams, that was proliferated through space policy in the United States. And now, throughout the world, those standard practices are enshrined in law around the world. But it had to have that technical foundation. So we are working closely with our interagency partners who are the regulators on this very critical issue. We believe that NASA has a role to play in developing capabilities for deorbiting orbital debris or managing it, the technical foundations behind that. And then we will let our interagency partners have the regulatory piece and oversee that. And I think the next step beyond that, of course, will be when we have developed that framework. Believe me, there's a lot of discussion about it right now. Then we hope to harmonize those activities with our international partners, because we really have to have a very consistent approach to that, because it's a global issue for sustainability.
China. 20 years ago, I hosted the first Chinese taikonaut at the Senate. I introduced him to Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon. We had a great conversation. And I told him, like the Russians, like the Soviets, in the midst of the Cold War, 1975, a Soviet spacecraft and an American spacecraft rendezvoused and docked in space, and the crews lived together. And those crews remained fast friends, so much so that when the Soviet commander, Alexei Leonov, just passed away 2 or 3 years ago, who was asked to give the eulogy in the big Moscow state funeral for Alexei, none other than General Tom Stafford, his lifelong friend as a result of that. I talked about that to the Chinese taikonaut. Subsequently, when the new Chinese ambassador was posted about a year ago to Washington, I happened to run into him in a Sunday brunch, and in the course of it told him that China has been very secretive, very non-transparent. Good example of that, and I gave him the example. At that point, they had put up one component of their space station, and the big rocket The big rocket that put it up was tumbling back to Earth. They did not save enough fuel for a controlled reentry, and they would not give any information or coordinates about the rocket. That's happened now 3 times. And on the second one, we thought it was going to go into Greece, and then we thought it was going into Saudi Arabia, and fortunately it went into the Indian Ocean. So I said to him, Mr. Ambassador, I'll give you an example of something that you could do. You have returned samples of the lunar soil. We returned samples 50 years ago. We made it available to the international community. You should do the same. Nothing. That was over a year ago. So I think it's obvious that they have decided a different course. And it would be one that they will do their own without the sharing with others. Sometimes they talk about that sharing, but it doesn't happen. So that's my answer to your question.
Thank you.
Final question, Hamish Arthur.
G'day, Senator Colonel. Thanks for your presentation. Hamish Arthur, former journalist and member of the National Press Club. Just want to talk about the growth of the space industry in Australia, and I think earlier in your presentation you mentioned about PPPs, public-private partnerships. How do we promote further growth of the sector in Australia, notwithstanding the great work that the Space Agency is doing at the moment? And I believe there's an organisation in the US, the National Space Council. Do we need to look at establishing something like that here, along with PPPs? And just interested to hear how they may work, or how they do work in the US, and as I said, what they could be applicable here as well.
Well, first I'll address the National Space Council. For us, it's critically important. We have a lot of activity, and the U.S. government is very large. So that coordination and the leadership of the Vice President in chairing that council has been critical to us. I will just make the observation, I'm well aware of the other agencies that the Australian Space Agency coordinates with here in Australia, and there don't seem to be any substantial issues between them. I think they've been coordinating together, just again as an outsider observing that. The time may come when that will become important, but right now I think Australia actually benefits from being having a smaller population, because you can actually get everybody in the room together and solve their problems. As far as the public-private partnerships, I'm just going to say that we have spent a lot of time with our international partners who've asked us about our playbook and how we did that. So it's important to understand that it's not one size fits all. So if we believe there is a true commercial market for a capability, launch would be a great example of that. In the case of any form of transportation, it's a well understood business model around that. We can invest and partner on the technical capability that we need, but then take advantage of economies of scale. When there's other customers, it brings the price down for everybody. And in space, those economies are significant. But in some cases, for example, a Mars transport vehicle, probably not a near-term commercial market for that. So we'll make that investment from the beginning. We will partner with industry, but we'll drive it to our requirements, not just step back and let someone innovate around it. Well, we'd like to get innovation, but I think we'll be driving the requirements on that. But it is really critical that the government understands their industry partner when they make those decisions, and they understand how to incentivize both the government and industry to work together effectively. We're pretty proud of how we've done that for commercial crew and cargo. We've learned a lot from it, and we're happy to share.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for your time today. It's been absolutely wonderful having you. So everyone, please join me in thanking Senator Bill Nelson and Pam Melroy. Thank you so much.